floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm Elizabeth Oriel, and I'm going to talk about something that's quite outside my normal realm and is a little bit vulnerable, but I've been making these drawings and paintings that sort of are guided by plants. And I've been drawing and painting for years. I've been drawing plants for years. So this is like a real change in terms of sort of expressing another being's perspective through artwork. I'm going to talk about how I make the art. I'm going to talk about sort of my own story with plants and understanding plant agency, which has kind of been a number of years in process. And I'm also going to connect it to theory and this idea that we live in this biosemiotic field, that we live in this field that plants and humans participate in. And someone who talked a lot about this is Eduardo Kohn, an anthropologist who's worked with the Runa in Ecuador. Plants have been silenced as so many species have been. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do in this work is bring other beings forward. And like as Latour says, we've rendered earthly conditions invisible. So there's really an effort here to access other beings' perspectives, and I'm sort of positing that hope comes from this. That hope we can access hope. I mean, it ties in with the last talk in a way, because I'm going to make the point that accessing other beings' perspectives, it is a form of orientation, is a form of, I don't call it a mental map, but it is a sort of mapping of our connection to the world. Oh, there we go. So we now, there's been this burgeoning science around plants and communication in the last few decades, and we now, even though it's somewhat controversial still, I was in London talking to a scientist at UCL recently who said it's still controversial. We don't really know if plants communicate. But there's so many studies that talk about how they communicate electrically, they communicate through mycorrhizal networks. And then there's these sort of two researchers who talk about plants communicating with humans, sort of in this other kind of way, that's not necessarily electrical, but it could be. But it's a kind of communicative realm that we're in with plants, and they both rely on indigenous knowledge and experience with indigenous people. Eduardo Kohn talks about how forests speak in images, which kind of relates to what I'm trying to do here with artwork. And he also talks about the importance of play in this field, in this biosemiotic field. And that is also what I'm really doing. I'm experimenting and playing and kind of I'm not really sure what I'm doing completely. There we go. In the meantime, I met an indigenous leader when I was in London who talked to me about how plants speak in the context of his tribe in Brazil, where plants are actually the ones who diagnose illness, and they tell the healer which plants to use. So there's so much communication going on in that tribal setting. And then the North American, Robin Wall-Kimmer is from the Potawatomi tribe, but she's also a hard scientist. And she talks a lot about communications with plants and coming away from those experiences, knowing new things. So we're a really small group here, but I just wanted to ask if anyone has sort of experienced human-plant interactions in their own life. And if you can, raise your hand.
I mean, all the time when I garden.
Okay.
When I'm eating.
Okay.
Psychedelics.
Okay.
I'm not an active user, but I have.
Okay.
I mean, all the time.
Yeah. And like, do you find there's like a benefit? I mean, in your
Last
sort
time I
of,
did mushrooms was great.
okay, thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, I find like this practice of doing this artwork sort of interestingly beneficial. Like I feel, and I sort of imagine that I'm in this other realm of this sort of this biosemiotic realm that brings this sort of whole other perspective. It's like a whole different way of being. And, you know, so I just wondered if other people experience that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I want to talk to you about this afterwards, but I feel like it changes my sense of time.
Interesting.
Yeah. Just because it like the movement is so slow, right? So like
Right.
appreciating that the plant is moving like you are.
Right.
Just much slower.
Absolutely. So you're tapping into plant time.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So no, there's all these ways I think we can actually tap into their perspective. So I also think this very much relates to like building a multi-species politics and thinking about multi-species flourishing and sort of breaking down these barriers of separation that we're so ensconced in. So in terms of my own plant story, I was studying human-elephant conflict in Sri Lanka and kind of had some issues with my research, and at one point kind of shifted into thinking with plants and sort of how plants in terms of forest cover and cultivation practice, how they really mediate relationships on the land. So they're so foundational. Human elephant conflict is a result of, elephants lose their terrain through development, and then they eat crops, and then there's conflict between farmers and elephants. And like plants are just foundational to human elephant coexistence and human elephant conflict. And human elephant conflict has become a really severe issue in many places now. So I've written a bunch on this and tried thinking with plants. I also think a lot with Felix Guattari and his three ecologies and sort of this idea that the subjective, the social, and the ecological are not separate spheres, and that the way land is divided up, whether there's access or no access, how plants are cultivated, all of these like present themselves in people's own subjective experience and in the community. So these things aren't separate. I've written a bunch on this stuff. This paper I wrote was on sort of aspects of permeability, what I'm talking about in terms of the social and the subjective and the ecological, and the fact that we're not, we are permeable beings, and that the way we interact with plants ends up dictating so much of sort of how we view ourselves and how we view others. So yeah, and something that was going on in Sri Lanka at this sort of similar time frame as I was there was a form of multi-species politics. So the farmers were protesting. There was lots of issues with distribution of crops and things like that that they were protesting. But one of their primary demands was that elephants have more rights and that elephants have better lives. And so it was just so inspirational that to learn from that as a kind of approach that we can adopt in the West as well. Sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so this led me to write this book that's coming out in the fall, and it's about plants. It's about plant influence and how we are shaped by plants. And so one chapter is about human-elephant conflict and what I've been explaining to you about, and each other chapter is sort of takes a single plant and talks about how that plant has shaped human society over time. And so yeah, this is part of part of where I've been going with this. So as part of this, I've been experimenting with making these drawings that express plants' own perspective and subjectivity. And I have like these little experimental books that I'm making that you can take a look at if you want. Pass them out. And so basically I take a species and I hold the species and I ask for guidance and I try to communicate, create an internal communication with that species. And I use this kind of kinesiology, which I've learned many years ago, that I use in sort of healthcare contexts. And so I ask the plant questions. And who knows if I'm like really communicating with this plant, but these are some of the images I've created. This one is mistletoe. So I'm also working with place-based, settings. So this is actually I live part-time in New Mexico, and this is mistletoe that grows in New Mexico. This is juniper that grows in New Mexico. This is one of my favorite plants, Yerba Mansa, which grows in the Bosque in New Mexico on the Rio Grande. It's like it's becoming extinct, but it's a very important plant ecologically and medicinally. This is Cholla cactus, also in New Mexico. And I'm working to develop like these plant pictures into kind of like an actual map that, or like a sort of map/diagram of place. These are from, oh, it's not very good resolution. This is from Denmark. This is St. John's wort. This is nettle. And this is willow. And willow I have a really strong connection to because in Denmark I've been living in a willow basket making community in school. And so I'm surrounded every day by willow and I've been taught to make baskets, and so I have a really strong connection to willow. And I want to say like this part of this, it for me is also just having like this constant practice of every day going out and observing plants and sort of developing rapport with plants wherever I am. And here's just like some of the images put together. So yeah, so once I come to sort of create these maps, I think of them as sort of orientations to a biosemiotic field. And I think this biosemiotic field is, like I was saying, is sort of central to thinking about addressing climate change. It has its own axes of activism. In terms of like when I'm making these drawings, like what am I actually accessing here? Like when I'm making a drawing of nettle, the question is like, I'm not, I may be holding some nettle, but I'm sort of connecting in with this nettle. And I kind of imagine that what I'm connecting in with is what Goethe talks about as plant archetypes. He wrote about plant archetypes and the metamorphosis of plants and how these archetypes are what help create the development of the plant from the seed all the way through the different stages. And they hold the form of the plant. So that's what I imagine that I'm making contact with. So in terms of this field that I'm talking about, Eduardo Kohn in his How Forests Think, writes about this field quite a bit. And he talks about how all beings in a forest can communicate and can interpret, and so can think. And they're not using symbolic language, but they're using, as he said, they communicate in images. They also communicate affectively. He talks about like the ways that sort of laugh laughter can move across beings. And that there's no like sort of like purposeful drivenness to this communication, that it's very distributed, that agency is existing, in various places. And it really breaks down these sort of linear approaches and that play is very much central. And that being attuned to this field is causes us to be less disjointed from the effects of our actions. So it brings us more into relationship with what we're doing to the earth. And it opens up really a different way of being. And that is sort of what I feel when I make these, images. Another person who writes, I think, similarly about this sort of relational field is the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who talks about how in the modern world we live in this I-it relationship where we objectify plants, we objectify the world, and that there's this sort of, and we sort of think as consumers, we think of consuming experience, and that sort of to move past that is being in a deeper rapport where you are in a kind of reciprocal relationship with the world that involves really a sort of deep responding. And so there's also people who write about the embodied empathy across species. And there's also, writing about shape-shifting as a form of, that art is even a form of shape-shifting. This is experimental and I don't know what I'm doing, but it feels like there's some breakdown in the sense that I have a distinct body and that plant has a distinct body. There's some kind of shared reality and shared bodies happening. So I think that these kinds of experiments need to happen in various ways. That was just said in that workshop discussion, it's hard to sort of think about how to access another species perspective and how to bring that forward. And we just need to try. I think we just need to experiment with it in various ways. And I think that art can feed that, and that that art and politics can be a dialogue around that. And that this is actually a form of activism in its own strange way. And I do have goals for what I want to do with these drawings. So there's ways that I envision them becoming sort of part of activism in a more practical sense. In sort of campaigns that speak for plants, that speak for campaigns that ban certain kinds of chemicals. So yeah, at the moment, it's kind of this etheric quality to it, but I do see it sort of having some traction eventually and becoming more part of actually making certain kinds of changes that will benefit the plants in the long run. And I think difference is really key. I mean, it's funny because Eduardo Kohn talks a lot about how he's leaving difference aside, and that he's all about continuity, that we have so much continuity with other species, and that's sort of the glue. And the difference is sort of, it's how we think about us as being distinct. But it can also be highly misleading. And Stella Stanford in her book on vegetal philosophy talks about this and how plants are subjects that are truly, truly different, and we can't sort of think in animal ways about them, and we can't make them knowable. And yeah, just sort of finish with this Kohn idea that we can give way to the who we might become with others, and that the larger self emerges. So
Thank you.